already made up your mind that this is a wonderful guest.
I hope so. Not the opposite.
So just a few pieces of information about John. He completed his dissertation almost 4 years ago. Not quite.
Not quite. Yeah.
Not quite.
Yeah.
Okay. Is published in APSR. Seems 4 times now. AGPS, Journal of Politics, British Journal, Nature, and most importantly, this wonderful book that you really have to buy, to read carefully, Making Young Voters. So John is a very productive, extremely productive scholar. I was trying to define his interest. It wasn't absolutely clear to me, so I checked the website. And it's it's in the list of topics I think is very, I think revealing it. I think was very well chosen. Political participation, of course. Political inequality, of course, crucial. Democratic accountability, so inequality and accountability, that's the big combination. Political representation, not quite as exciting, might be.
Small question.
And education policy at the end, which is extremely important. So it's a real pleasure to have him. He is not only a productive scholar, but a very decent human being, and that I appreciate a lot. Open-minded, dynamic, and he'll tell you about everything about whether voting is transformative.
Oh, thank you, Andre. Oh, it's so meaningful to hear those very nice comments. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to be telling you about some of my research that I've been doing with a colleague at Duke University, Marcus Rangel, about whether voting is transformative. So Andre already made the plug for the book. So I was going to say this talk is sponsored today. This is an ad to pick up the book. It dropped yesterday. Available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble for the deal of $34.99. Okay, so this project, I'm not talking to you about the book today, but I'm talking to you about a project that sprung out as I was thinking over the past few years about voting and voting behavior more generally. To give you a bit of background, I did my PhD training at a policy school, so I have a PhD in public policy. And during my time in my PhD program, I interacted with many non-political scientists. And one of the things that they would commonly ask me is why I was working on voting, right? And particularly, this question tended to come from a certain type of person, economists. So I hear this question: why should we care about voting? From a grumpy economist at Stanford School.
Why should we care about voting? From a grumpy economist.
It's okay. So I get this question a lot from my grumpy economist colleagues, and now I'm actually realizing in real time that there's a redundancy on this slide. So let me see if I can fix it in real time. There we go. All economists, by definition, I think, are a little bit grumpy. Now that I've alienated any economists in the room, I want to say that this question actually was really beneficial to me. As I was thinking about how to answer this question, I started to think about empirical projects that could sort of try and answer what is kind of a normative or a more bigger picture question. Why should we care about voting? And to give you an idea of, like, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and wrote a little bit about in the dissertation in the book as well, why we should care about voting, something that we sometimes as political scientists take as a given. I think there are a couple of reasons why we should pay attention to voting. Now, this list is not meant to be comprehensive in any way, but here are a few things that I've thought of. Okay, so voting is a core measure of democratic well-being. It's a way to see the health of a democratic society. It's a puzzling and interesting human behavior. It turns out many of my economist colleagues, I think, thought that the last words on voter turnout were said by Downs in the 1950s. Lol. We have a lot of good evidence from sort of exogenous shocks to voter turnout that who votes, how many people vote, and who is voting affects who gets elected to public office that they implement. And then finally, and this fourth one was one that I would often turn to when I had a sort of grumpy economist say to me, why should we care about voting? I would say, well, okay, maybe you don't care about voting per se, but you care about pro-sociability more generally, right? Or you care about engagement in a community to solve local community problems, to sort of overcome the tragedy of the commons. We're talking sort of economist language now. So I said to myself, is this really true? Is it the case that voting is sort of a strongly linked, and perhaps more importantly, does voting itself have transformational properties? So these other explanations for why we might want to pay attention to voting are important, but this is the one that we're focusing in on in this study. Okay, so to give you context, this isn't surprising to all of you who are familiar with voting behavior research. There's a lot of research out there on answering questions like who votes, why do people vote, and how can we increase voting. The check marks are not meant to entail that those subjects are done. There's obviously lots more good stuff to be said, and these are not all the studies that have been done on these topics. But we've had relatively less research about whether voting is transformative. So instead of looking at voting as a dependent variable, turning voting into an independent variable, thinking about the types of things that voting itself influences. Okay? So we're talking today about whether voting itself is transformative in two ways. Number one, after a person has a voting experience, whether or not they change in any other way in their attitudes and behaviors that are maybe adjacent to voting. And then also, whether or not leading into the act of voting, there are any sort of signs of preparation, right? Any sort of change in the person leading up to the act of voting. We're thinking about acts of civic engagement beyond voting here. So we're not in the realm of does voting in one period cause voting in another. We're thinking about adjacent attitudes, volunteering, belonging, political interest, political knowledge, these types of things that we think are contributors to voting, but might also be byproducts of the voting process itself. Okay? I'm going to take you through the logic for why we might expect that voting influences other attitudes and behaviors, like the ones I've just mentioned. And it's going to feel a little bit like I'm hitting you over the head with the argument. There's 6 reasons that I think why we might want to do this, look at voting as an independent variable as well. And the reason why I'm hitting you over the head of it as a preview is the null effects, right? We find that voting itself is not transformative, or at least in the dimensions that we can explore. So I want to set up for you the reasons why it might be. And I think there are some strong ex-ante theoretical reasons why we might expect when someone votes that they're changed in other ways. Okay? So the first is that many scholars have just sort of asserted that this is the case, right? There's some pretty strong quotes out there in prominent locations that voting is transformative. There's obviously a strong correlation between voting and other acts of civic participation. There's an argument that that correlation reflects reciprocal causation or simultaneous causation, that voting is promoted by like political interest, political knowledge, other forms of engagement, that they contribute to voting, but then also voting contributes back to them. There's been arguments in the persistence of voting literature about the reason why voting in one period causes voting in future periods might be because of attitudinal changes that we can sort of actually look at. This plays into arguments about compulsory voting. We have some evidence from compulsory voting. We're drawing some of our evidence rather from compulsory voting. And then we have some small-scale experiments that I'll tell you about that are suggestive that when you get someone to vote, they just automatically or generically change in other dimensions that are adjacent to voting. Okay, so why would we expect an effect? Number one, just plain and simple, many scholars have argued that this is the case, right? So the more people vote, the more they become civically minded. Voting helps develop intellectual and moral capacities that are intrinsically important. Okay, Galston goes on to talk about how people who vote are more likely to become involved in their communities, to be more pro-social, to be more interested in politics, things like that. Okay, and then voting experiences can have long-lasting effects on political orientations. We see a lot of these arguments as well in the Get Out the Vote literature. We're thinking about interventions to increase voter turnout and their potential effects. So Gerber, Green, and Shekar, in their sort of classic persistence and participation paper, any intervention that raises turnout should also heighten feelings of political efficacy, trust, interest in politics, or other attitudes conducive to voter participation. Or more recently, Coppock and Green, voting may cause a person to take heightened interest in politics, feel a stronger sense of civic duty, or become more familiar with the process by which votes are cast. So it's a political knowledge. Okay. So that's just the direct assertion that's been made. These are not the only quotes. There's many more in the paper. I should say that this is, I should have said this at the beginning, this research project is part of 2 papers primarily talking to you about the newer evidence in the second paper, a little bit from the first paper as well. Okay. Second reason why we might expect that voting actually transforms people, that actually changes them in some way in terms of their attitudes and behaviors, is if we look at the simple relationship between voting and other measures of civic engagement, either attitudinal or behavioral, there's a pretty strong relationship. So what I'm showing you here is these outcomes standardized, the bivariate relationship between voting and these other types of metrics of civic engagement that we might care about. As you can see, there's quite a bit of variation in effect sizes. But some of these are quite sizable. So if we look at the bivariate relationship between political interest and voting, this relationship is quite strong. On the weaker end, sort of memberships, not so strong. So this is from the ANES cumulative file. So there's a sense that like, okay, well, maybe this is actually evidence, maybe or suggestive evidence, or pointing us in the direction of saying, okay, maybe voting actually promotes these things. Maybe there is something to this idea that's been asserted by scientists in the past. And the argument goes one step further to be more formalized when people say, okay, this correlation that we just saw in the graph previous is supposedly reflective of simultaneous causation, right? So when we run a regression where voting is our dependent variable and we have political interests in there, we often worry that we're picking up on some sort of bias because voting is actually the primary, or not the primary mover. Voting is influencing political interest as much as interest is affecting our voter turnout. So we see this in arguments. Brady Burbage-Lozman's classic 1995 work. It's kind of tacky for me to put all the pages where they argue this, but I just want to drive home the point that this argument has been made a lot. Political interest may be as much of an effect as a cause of political activity. Okay, I see this with political knowledge as well. The act of voting means that citizens are forced to think, at least to some extent, about politics, elections, and the major parties. So getting engaged sort of forces you to think about these things that are sort of building a certain level of political knowledge. Belonging, voting in elections stimulates participation and interest in other political and organizational activities. And then pro-sociability, this is the second piece of that Galston quote that I showed to you earlier, that voting itself may develop a wider human sympathy, skills to work well with others, towards collective action, powers of sympathy, sort of an absence of empathy, to build bridges with other people, right? So when the argument is sort of formally made and often built into models of voting that there's this endogenous relationship between voting and these measures of civic engagement, okay? Fourth reason we might expect a transformative effect is the piece of the argument that has been made by scholars of sort of habitual voting or the persistence of voting. So often the theorized mechanisms for why voting in one period causes voting in another period are along the lines of psychological transformation, right? That once you vote, it changes your internal motivations, your beliefs about yourself and the world around you. And there's some pretty explicit argumentation that that's a potentially likely channel. So the alternative is that you're sort of getting experiential skills, that you're getting used to the process, you're sort of having an experience that's not necessarily about your beliefs and your attitudes and your behaviors, but sort of becoming more familiar with the process itself, okay? Fifth reason we might expect transformative effects is debates over compulsory voting have long sort of included discussions about whether when you make voting mandatory or you impose penalties for not voting, there would be some attitudinal or behavioral effects beyond the simple act of voting as well. So when we think about debates about compulsory voting, people get concerned that by making an act compulsory, that people might sort of react negatively, that there might be a backlash, that they might suddenly be not as motivated to be engaged in politics because they're being forced to do something, okay? They're sort of maybe losing intrinsic motivation by being forced to vote, okay? On the flip side, there have been arguments in favor of compulsory voting that have sort of said, hey, compulsory voting might actually be the easiest and cheapest way, or the sort of equivalent but much less expensive way of doing civics education, right? So it's more than just increasing voter turnout, but it's accomplishing the other goals of civics, right? Of creating engaged people who are involved in their communities, who know about the political issues at hand, and so forth. Okay, so this often comes into play with arguments maybe going in either direction, suggesting that when compulsory voting kicks in, it might promote civic engagement, or when it kicks in, it might actually decrease civic engagement. Okay? And then the final reason why we might expect a transformative effect is we actually do have some evidence from well-designed, in this case, an experimental study, that suggests maybe when all you need to do to get people more civically engaged is get them to vote, that other civic attitudes and behaviors will naturally follow. Okay, so this is an interesting experiment that was published in the BJPS a couple years ago. Victoria Scheinman. The context is in San Francisco municipal elections. Municipal elections is important because in the United States, in municipal elections, it's not illegal to pay people to vote. So that's how she went about increasing voter participation. It was actually, they were sent a $25 gift card, and basically it was implied that if they didn't vote, they'd take the $25 gift card away from them. So trying to tap into the loss aversion kind of. Relatively modest sample size, and that comes into play a little bit in terms of what we think of the study. I mean, it's a small sample size for obvious reasons, right? You have to pay these people at the individual level to potentially vote, at least in the treatment group. The first result from this paper was a massive increase in voter participation, a 38 percentage point increase in voter participation. That's big. We don't usually see effects that big on voter participation. It's very rare. It's truly massive. Almost to the point of like, wow, okay. I don't know if I believe that. And the second finding, which sort of links into what I'm talking about, is even without doing anything else, without sending them information about the election, without encouraging them to find information about the candidates running in this municipal election, what was found was, as a natural byproduct of incentivizing people to vote, they became more knowledgeable about politics, at least in the 1 to 7 days after the election. So the follow-up survey was done like immediately after the election to see if they knew more. Across a number of measures of political knowledge, there was an increase, a fairly sizable one as well. But there are a number of unanswered questions from this study. So the first is this effect transient? Do you see an uptick in political knowledge that just fades away? Okay. Is this scalable? This is quite a bit smaller than most get out the vote studies that we see. So potentially at risk for type M or type S errors, magnitude or sign. The question remains is what happened before the election? Were there any transformative effects that happened before? I mean, this is kind of implied that this was preparation leading into the election, but it would have been nice to be able to see before the election if that preparation was indeed actually happening. And then we're just looking at political knowledge here. Okay, it'd be nice to know if voting experiences affect other outcomes as well. Okay, so this is like the justification, a few reasons why we might want to expect or think that voting itself is transformative in some way. So just to sum up, the theory is that when people vote, they sort of, and this might be sort of like a nice hierarchy of how it works, a theoretical model, but I'm not imposing that upon people. But just so you get like the theoretical idea of what we're thinking, is when people vote, they might say, this is interesting. I like this thing, politics. It's kind of fascinating and engaging. They might be incentivized or feel obligated to become more informed about the political process. Not listed on here, but they might feel more efficacious. They might feel that, hey, I've accomplished this thing and suddenly I can do better in the future. That might motivate for them to participate in other ways, other formats. It might make them more likely to volunteer or to join a political party to mobilize other people, things like that. And it might make them overall more engaged in society or their communities as a whole. But the motivation for this paper is that we have some evidence, as I've mentioned to you, whether the transformative voting hypothesis is what we're formalizing this hypothesis. The evidence is limited, and especially the causal evidence is somewhat limited. Okay. All right. There are reasons to be skeptical that voting is transformative. So I've given you sort of like the most favorable conditions, the reasons why voting would be transformative, but there are reasons to suspect that voting, it doesn't change people as well. If you actually look at, for many people, the voting experience is relatively short. Now, we have exceptions where people are waiting in line for hours and hours to vote. But if we think about theoretically whether or not the casting of a ballot is transformative, we should realize that this is often like an intermittent behavior that's relatively short, right? So if it were transformative, maybe we'd be a little surprised. That's just to say there are reasons to suspect and to be suspect of a transformative effect. Okay. All right, so how do we go about doing this? What design should we use? What research design should we use to test whether or not voting is transformative? So we could do a couple of things. So the first that we could do is collect information on whether or not people vote, whether or not they volunteer, their levels of political knowledge, levels of political interest, like we would do in the standard political survey, and then just control for the standard predictors of political participation, right? That's one approach that we could take. The issue here is the unobservables that would be hard to measure, right? And further, right, we're kind of worried implicitly that there's a reverse process going on. Even if we see a relationship between voting and other attitudes and behaviors, it might be actually just picking up the direct reverse causal relationship. Okay, so we're going to X out that approach. We're not going to take that approach here. There's some really interesting and valuable research that helps build expectations and helps us learn about whether voting is transformative, but we're going to try and move to sort of exogenous variation in voting. So when we think about areas in political science, social science research where we have sort of voting being moved, all else equal, we might suddenly go to get out the vote studies. So these are random, interventions to get people, campaign tactics, mailers, phone calls, door knocking, et cetera, to get people to vote. Then maybe we could look at attitudinal changes there. I think that would be a really cool thing to do. Not many studies actually do this. However, there are a couple of reasons just to pump the brakes a little bit in doing a get out the vote RCT. The first is if you're looking for sort of transformative effects, you're implicitly looking for spillover effects. It's not the direct effect. These are just sort of incidental changes or externalities that come when you get people to vote. So in order to see those, to be well-powered enough to see those, you want to have a large effect sort of on your first stage, right? A large enough effect on voting itself to be able to see any sort of correspondent transformative effects down the road. Okay. I won't get too much into the problem number 2. This is sort of just like a theoretical problem. I can talk more about it if you want to. But one of the challenges when doing a get out the vote study is if you pick an intervention that maybe is particularly effective, you might worry that it's not the actual act of voting that's doing any transformative effects, but it's the actual intervention itself. You're worrying about the third path, the exclusion restriction being violated here. So say I did a social pressure mailer, an effective way of increasing voter turnout, probably the most effective for get out the vote campaigns. We might not have an effect on social awareness through voting. People might just become more socially aware about their people around them and what they think about them and their various neighbors' attributes just because they're suddenly being monitored, right? So there are reasons why we'd be a little bit skeptical there. And then it's a little bit hard, it's not impossible to think about how we do this, to do a get out the vote campaign and then to measure something before voting. It's a little tricky, but maybe we could do this, right? And we actually, in some of our meta-analyses, we are not throwing out get vote studies. There are some interesting ones that I think can bring some illuminating evidence, but that's not the first place we turn. All right, so where we're turning is to sort of a natural experimental approach that's trying to get the good causality that we get out of sort of a randomized controlled trial, but in a world that's it's naturally happening, we're worrying a little bit less about conflating the intervention's direct effects itself versus the act of voting. Okay, so the approaches that we're going to take, sort of alluding to the workshop yesterday, no shocker, we're using a regression discontinuity design. And the regression discontinuity design is pulling information from Brazil. That's the first paper that's forthcoming at JOP, so I'll just benchmark, show you the findings for that if you're not familiar with them. We're looking before and after an election, right? So before to see if there's any sort of anticipatory or preparation before an election. And we're going to compare those who are marginally exposed to a compulsory voting rule. They're highly incentivized to vote to those who are under a voluntary voting rule. That's exclusively in Brazil. Then we're going to look at make a comparison between individuals who are eligible to voluntary vote versus those who are not eligible to vote at all. Okay, so we can make that comparison again in Brazil. That's from paper 1. And we have new data from the United States that compares individuals around the voting eligibility cutoff in the US. And then the last thing we're going to do, once we pull in sort of paper 1 from Brazil, paper 2 using the USA, we're going to meta-analyze the sort of somewhat limited quasi-experimental, natural experimental, and field experimental studies that have been done in this area in the past. We're not the first people to talk about whether voting is transformative in a causal way. We're going to meta-analyze the results. Okay, so we're going to try and draw general conclusions from the literature. Okay. One brief aside, and this is something that we've engaged with a little bit with reviewers. I don't know if this has occurred to you during the presentation, but I want to get it sort of out on the table before we move on so that you can sort of understand what our goal is here. So in our meta-analysis, just to provide you a brief preview, we have both quasi-experiments, sort of natural experiments, things that are happening where there's sort of these natural increases or shocks to vote participation. And we also have the vote experiments where people, researchers are like doing an intervention explicitly to increase voter participation. So there's a little bit of a ambiguity as to what we should call this treatment, these types of treatments. They're a little bit different from each other. So what's the terminology? So you'll hear me referring to these as various things, right? So I might say the causal effect of a voting experience, sort of alluding to those who are exposed to the opportunity to vote. Nudges to vote, sort of a get out the vote type of intervention, voting programs, or when appropriate, voting eligibility itself. We're just comparing those who are eligible versus not. The key motivating question here, just to solidify concept, is when we exogenously increase voter turnout, be it through any of these sort of types of ways of doing that, are there corresponding changes to attitudes and behavior? Okay. All right, the first data set that we have to do this is from Brazil. It's a fairly large data set that my co-author kind of stumbled over. My co-author is an economist who does development economics, not really civic engagement stuff, but he was telling me about a data set that he found and asking if I would be able to use it. It's a really cool data set. It's a set of school records, school administrative records from the ENEM. So this is like kind of equivalent to like the ACT or SAT in the United States. However, it's probably taken by more students because it's not just for going to college, it's also for professional certification as well. It's one of the second largest sex exam in the world. We have data from 2006, 2007, a little bit old, but it's really an interesting data set. Ultimately, we're not using all 9 million observations. We're looking close to specific cutoffs, so we're closer in the neighborhood of 100,000, still quite a bit of people. This exam is really nice because in addition to testing students on language proficiency, math proficiency, and science proficiency, at the end of the exam, students are asked to fill in a survey. It's literally tacked onto the end of the exam. And in that survey, they ask political questions. It was so amazing to find this. We were like, oh, wow, this is super cool. I'm glad they did this. I don't know what education administrator decided to do this, but if I ever find out, I'll give them a big hug. Because this is not us putting them on the survey, on the exam. They were just there, existing already. So we have measures of political interest at different levels of government. Belonging, it turns out, so this is people who are completing high school, so they're asking them about belonging to the types of organizations that like a young person would belong to, so like clubs, they have sports and their political parties, community organizations, et cetera, et cetera. They have a couple of questions that are meant to elicit people's social awareness or pro-sociability. So they ask them the extent to which they witness discrimination of various types, the extent to which they pay attention to various social issues. And then from the exam itself, sort of backing into the exam, there's an essay on the ENEM where students are given a social problem and asked how they would go about solving it. And then that's graded by instructors. So it's sort of a social problem solving essay. Okay. And then finally, on the ENEM, we have measures of the extent to which they read political information. It's not exactly political knowledge. But then we also have sort of going back into the exam again. It's kind of a test of history, but it's more so like a test of current political affairs and historical political affairs. Okay. We have this from two periods, two different cohorts. Important. 1 month before the election and then 10 months after the election. Then for a really small piece of the data set we have, we observe individuals 2 years after the election as well. Okay. What this means is we can't sort of rule out effects that come right after the election and then go away, that are there like in the days afterwards and then just completely go away. But we think that this is actually somewhat a minimal problem for two reasons. First, when we're thinking about whether voting is transformative, we're not looking for effects that are lasting for 1 or 2 days and then go away. We want to know if voting is truly transformative, as the name implies. So that's one reason. The second thing is we actually in the US, we can do closer to the election measures to sort of see if there are effects initially that fade out over time. Anytime I present this result, I put the caveat out there that I'm not an expert of Brazilian elections. So if you have lots of questions about Brazilian elections, I hope that they're answered on this slide. I don't know a lot about the context there. Here's some information, however, that you might be curious about how elections are run in Brazil. So in 2006, was the specific race with Lula in it. Voting, this is important. The top point is important for our design. In Brazil, voting is compulsory for citizens between the ages of 18 and 80. So we're going to actually use that arbitrary age cutoff. We're also going to use the cutoff of the fact that 16 and 17-year-olds are eligible to voluntary vote. It's not compulsory for them, but they're eligible to voluntary vote. So if we compare individuals who are sort of born a day into sort of the compulsory voting eligibility to those who are in the voluntary voting eligibility, this creates an increase in voter turnout about 12 to 15 percentage points. I'll show you that effect. The increase of the voluntary voting cutoff between individuals who are eligible to voluntary vote and those who are not eligible to vote at all is about a 25 percentage point increase in this election. Here's some information about what happens if you don't vote and you're under the compulsory voting system, and then the overall levels of turnout in Brazilian elections. Okay. Second data set is from the US. So it's a similar sort of sampling frame. However, we had a little bit more input on the measures here, not a ton of input, but some input on the measures that were put on this survey. So this was a survey of takers of the ACT, kind of the high school or exit or college entrance exam in the United States, taken by about 60% of high schoolers. We have two waves of that survey, one in 2016, one in 2018. This sample is smaller than the Brazilian test. Partially because this was a survey that was sent after the exam. It wasn't tacked on, it wasn't stapled on the end of the exam, so we have a little bit lower response rate. The ACT survey measures things like political interest, political knowledge, social awareness, but measured slightly different. And then in 2018, we wanted to know not only whether or not voting was going to affect these things like directional preferences, exposure to fake news, and favorability towards Trump. We sort of just wanted to get a sense of where young people were as well for some other descriptive research we have. So we have these, we can look at them. The timing of this was about a month after both of these elections. In December is when the survey went out. This helps us rule out any sort of fade out effects. And then the sort of first stage or the effect on voter participation here is large. So the voluntary voting cutoff, it's about a 20 to 30 percentage point increase. So again, we're looking for scenarios where we have a big effect on voter turnout to sort of maximize the chances if there are any spillover effects of seeing them. Okay, the third and final data set, and then we're getting into results, is the meta-analysis. So 2 months ago, we went through the process of finding any paper that was publicly available, published or unpublished, that employed some sort of natural quasi or field experimental approach that increased voter participation and had measures of political interest, political knowledge, other forms of civic engagement. Ultimately, we relied on authors for their defining of their own method as a natural quasi or randomized experiment. And what that ended up with the studies who were randomized control trials, regression discontinuity, and differences. Ultimately, we found that the areas where the most studies have been done is the extent to which voting shocks changed political knowledge and political interests. So those are the two outcomes that we could do the sort of more thorough meta-analysis, but we're looking on other outcomes as well. And then maybe seems kind of obvious, but in order to be included in the meta-analysis, you either have to give us your replication data or you have to standardize your results so that we can have the dependent variables on the same scale, like when we're meta-analyzing the data together. There were only a few that were excluded for that reason. Then finally, once we pulled together this list, we emailed 20 experts of voting. Andre was so generous to reply and help us find additional work. And then two other just broader listservs that have voting scholars on them to see if we missed anything. Okay. What ended up was 9 studies. So there have been some people who have studied this using various approaches in various contexts to see whether or not there's an exogenous shock to voting, whether or not that changes the voters' attitudes or behaviors. Okay. Yeah, a variety of different contexts, a variety of different treatments to get voting. I think this is actually a strength. They're slightly different studies, different designs, but we're trying to see if there's sort of any systematic evidence of an effect or if there's heterogeneity across different types of treatments. Okay, so the methods we're using for Brazil and the United States, as I've alluded, is a regression discontinuity design, leveraging precise differences in date of birth, right? So on the date of election in Brazil, if you are just 18, if you've just turned 18, it's your birthday and election day, you are in a compulsory system of voting, versus if you were born, if you were 1 day younger than that, you'd be under a voluntary voting system. Similar thing for Brazil and the United States between voluntary voting and not eligible to vote. Okay. Okay, so in Brazil, we can sort of do this anticipatory effect before the election a month before. We can look downstream, and then we can potentially pool these different treatments together. In the US, it's just looking for downstream effects because the survey happened after the election. Okay, this is just to say that the stuff that we talked about yesterday, different specifications of the running variable, bandwidth use, bias correction, all the types of things that we do in a standard RD setting, it's robust. That I'm not going to bore you with like a million different robustness checks, yeah. You might be wondering, since I've already told you that this is going to be a null effect, whether or not we're adequately powered. So we've done a power analysis. What I'm showing you here is across various effect sizes on the x-axis for our different outcomes that we have in the Brazil case specifically. The power coefficients. So the standard threshold is a power coefficient of 0.8. It's traditionally thought to be well powered. Across all of our outcomes, we're well powered enough to detect effects as small as about 7.5% of the standard deviation. And in many of the cases, not all, in many of the cases, we can go even smaller than that. We're well powered to see an effect about 5% of the standard deviation. And we're going to do one other thing, sort of post hoc equivalence testing, which sounds fancy, but it's basically just using your 95% confidence intervals to test not only against zero, but against meaningful effects. Okay. All right, in the meta-analysis, we're going to run things different ways, I'll show the results to you across different meta-analysis specification, and we test for heterogeneity across studies as well. All right, so here are the results from Brazil. So I'm going to start with the compulsory voting effects. So here's the effect at the cutoff for compulsory voting. So on this side here, individuals are exposed to compulsory voting, right? And on this side here on the left, they're exposed to voluntary voting. So as you can see, there's a distinct jump in rates of voter participation at the compulsory voting age cutoff, somewhere on the order of a 12 to 15 percentage point. It depends on the parameters that you're using. So compulsory voting increases voter participation among this young group of voters, okay? But what happens to their other measures of civic engagement, attitudinal and behavioral? Now I'm going to go through these relatively quickly because they're all very similar, all right? So here's what happens. This is leading up to the election, looking for any preparatory effects in the lead up to the act of voting itself. All right, here's the change in interest in politics. There's no change, okay? That looks like a null effect to me, okay? There's no change in memberships, maybe a tiny, tiny uptick. No changes in social awareness or political knowledge. Okay, so that's leading into the election. What about after the election? So again, here's the compulsory voting voter turnout effect. Interest in politics, memberships, social awareness, political knowledge, all null, okay? Now that's just the compulsory voting cutoff. I've told you that I have voluntary voting cutoffs as well, leading up to the election and afterwards. So all in all, 4 different estimates that we could do: voluntary voting upstream, voluntary voting downstream, compulsory voting upstream, compulsory voting downstream. And if we were willing to make an assumption that those treatments were similar, we could pool those effect estimates as well to get really precise estimates. So here are the results across all 4 of those different cutoffs and the pooled estimate. It's a little bit unwieldy here. So these are the facets here, are different outcomes that we have. And then we have the different cutoffs that we're looking at on the vertical axis here, with the standardized effect sizes being in place here. The reference line for 0 is shown in red, and then like a third of a standard deviation is shown in the gray lines. As you can see, across all of these, many of them are not significant, or pretty much all of them are not significant. And when we look to instances where we pool all of our data, it's all very precisely estimated at 0. So we have a little negative effect on political knowledge is not quite robust across specifications, so it's better to think of that as a null effect. Similar across all of them. And look how tiny the confidence intervals are. Not only are we not significantly different from zero, we're significantly different from meaningful effects. That's the logic of equivalence testing. Okay, because this is an unwieldy graph, one thing that we can do to sort of summarize the effects that we found is to take all the effect sizes and the sort of p-values or confidence levels and pool them together and show you them in a density, right? So this is another way of seeing the plots that I just showed you. Here are the coefficient estimates that we have and the density of them across all the model specifications I showed you. It's spiked at 0, right? We see sometimes positive effects, sometimes negative effects, but the most likely outcome is a 0 effect, okay? Similar thing with p-values. We sometimes see statistically significant effects, but for the most part, effects that are much larger than the traditional significance levels. So I won't go too deep into how we did this 2 years downstream. It was basically a relatively small cohort of individuals that we observed retaking the test again. So we can say, even past 10 months, are there any transformative effects that linger? The answer is no. Then sort of anytime you're presenting a null effects paper, one of the most common questions is to say, well, is it positive? Is the effect positive among some subgroups, negative among others, or 0 among others? Is there heterogeneity in treatment effects? The best we can tell, there's not. We've looked across all of our pre-treatment characteristics. So we've looked across social class background, race, gender of the individual. One of the interesting tests that was recommended by a reviewer to us was to look for any sort of like network type effects. So what this is showing is differences across schools that have more people voting versus fewer people voting. So the idea is maybe in an area where lots of your friends are going to the ballot box, you are somehow transformed more. It's exciting. Everyone's internalizing this norm of voting and going to the ballot box. Maybe that's where we see transformative effects. If that were the case, in areas where there was more treatment, we would see larger, probably positive effects. We don't actually see that. Okay. From the US, here are the results from the voluntary voting cutoff. So we don't have compulsory voting in the United States. We do have this age cutoff where people who are old enough, marginally old enough, can vote, but those who are not eligible cannot. So here's sort of the first stage or the manipulation check. Showed this yesterday in the regression, this continuity design workshop. So voter turnout on the y-axis, birthday relative to the election day cutoff. As you can see here across different modeling approaches of the relationship between birthday and voter turnout, this jump is pretty sizable. This is 0 here by design. These people aren't eligible to vote, right? So nobody's voting there. But we see sort of a 20 to 30 percentage point increase in the chances that someone would vote. So a fairly big treatment of voting, an exogenous shock to voting. I can show you that effect in standard deviations here on the coefficient plot. So to benchmark the effects on the other outcomes that we have in 2018, political interest, civic duty, political knowledge, liberal ideology, and exposure to fake news, they're all null, right? So in spite of being enhanced given the chance to vote, not much evidence of being transformed in other dimensions. We have a fewer outcomes in 2016. This is because we didn't actually give that much feedback on what was on the survey in 2016. 2018 is when we were able to add some things and change the survey a little bit. So we have a measure of social awareness, political interest, and political knowledge. The confidence interval is a little bit wider. The sample size is a little bit smaller. So if we pool across 2016 and 2018, when we have measures of political knowledge and political interest, then those are pretty precise. Right? So these exogenous increases to voting have no effect on political knowledge or political interest, suggesting that previous studies may have been underpowered or may have been just very local to the specific context that they were estimated. Okay, last result that I'll provide, and then I'll stop so we can have a discussion hopefully about this, is the meta-analysis across the 9 studies that I showed you earlier. So the 2 outcomes that we're able to look at with any substantive number of studies are political knowledge and political interest. So I'll show you political knowledge first. So here are the various coefficient estimates. They are scaled so that the coefficient itself means a change in the proportion of political item questions that you answered correctly. So as you can see, a few study designs have used RCT, diff and diff, randomized controlled trials. So these first 3 here are all like get out the vote studies. This is our Brazilian regression discontinuity design. This is another Brazilian regression discontinuity design. This is another Brazilian regression discontinuity design, okay? This Brazilian regression discontinuity design is by far the smallest sample size, and it has a distinct result that's different from the other two Brazilian RD studies. So maybe those two things are related to each other. And then when it says this study, this is the US cutoff. Okay, when we pool all of those coefficients together, it doesn't really matter how we do the meta-analysis estimate, but the effect is small, not significant except for this one here. But even in this case, when it's significantly positive, it's a relatively small effect, and we can rule out meaningful effect sizes. It's not really robust to other types of meta-analysis estimates either, so it makes us a little bit skeptical that that's a real effect. If it is a real effect, it's small. Okay. Here's the estimate for. Oh, sorry. One last thing to say. So one thing you check for in a meta-analysis is if there's heterogeneity across study designs to explore. In a standard, if you just put these studies into sort of a check for heterogeneity across tests, it says there is heterogeneity, but it's all because of this one, right? It's all driven by this one being so different from the rest of them. If you take that out, then there's not evidence of heterogeneity. Even less evidence of heterogeneity across treatment effects in the case of political interest, right? So when you get people to vote, it appears it does not change the levels of political interest, and there are the meta-analysis coefficients, very precise, not significant, and able to rule out very small effects. Okay. Null finding, but I am a card-carrying member of the null effects matter and team precise nulls family. And the reasons why I think this null effect is important is because we have theoretical reasons going into it that there would be an effect. There's a strong observational correlational relationship. There's been some small causal evidence that suggests voting is potentially transformative. We're providing better powered, well-designed evidence across many different contexts that voting is not transformative. Okay? That some of these transformative effects and assertions that have been made in the literature have been oversold a little bit. Okay? So one of the implications for this is actually kind of hopeful, right? So when we do the approach where we say, okay, let's estimate the predictors of voting, right? Let's predict voting with civic duty or political interest or political knowledge, and we see that these things are highly correlated with one another. A reviewer's response might frequently be, well, that's endogenous, right? Voting is affecting these outcomes as much as these outcomes are affecting voting the way that you've set it up. Maybe this is actually less of a big deal than we thought, right? We've provided some evidence, at least in our context, relative to the compliers and the populations that we're estimating. Those caveats aside, we're not actually showing some evidence of voting itself causing these other forms of civic engagement. From policy perspective, there's been a lot of calls to make voting compulsory. Now, if you want to increase voter participation, compulsory voting does that, right? But if you're going to make an argument beyond voting, that it's sort of transforming other attitudes that we hope civic education is affecting and helping young people to develop political awareness, political interest, political knowledge, et cetera, it doesn't really do that. We have pretty good evidence that's not the case, at least in Brazil. Okay? And then finally, as a substantive sort of end of the punchline, just because you get more people to vote doesn't guarantee that you have an increase in broader patterns of civic engagement. In order to solve sort of low, stagnant, maybe even declining levels of civic engagement, pro-sociability, social capital, you can't just get out the vote. Right? You have to do other things as well. Okay, with that I will stop, and I'm happy to answer questions, have a discussion. Are you all depressed? I was sort of like, my first reaction when I saw the results was like, oh yeah, I was going to show those economists that voting promotes pro-sociability, and then now I say that it's been fake. Yeah.
So is there any data that voting creates more subsequent voting?
Yeah, it definitely does. It for sure does. So voting itself transforms in the sense that it makes you more likely to be a voter later on. But from what we're seeing so far, it doesn't look like it's changing some of the other likely outcomes that
So that people develop an identity that I'm a person who votes?
Maybe. So they might have, they might also just get experiential knowledge. Like, this is something I know how to do now. They might have confidence related to the specific act of voting, but it's just not spilling over into other domains. Yeah, I mean, this sort of like I showed you the explanation for why voting creates voting in future periods has been either psychological transformation or sort of like experiential, contextual changes. This is, I would take our evidence as sort of saying, well, the experience or sort of the psychological channel is probably a little bit less likely. Maybe it's experiential, contextual.
Yeah, very, very depressing, I have to say. So I'm struggling with that a little bit.
Yeah.
But I wonder why maybe another way of triangulating the methods could be to look at the aggregate effects in the sense of what happens in a voting year. And is there something that you can measure in a society in a voting year? And I think Wendy Rahn has done a study, I don't know if you remember, whether generalized trust levels are different in a year of a national vote in the US. And she has adjusted in the analysis also the date of the survey, whether it has been taken before or after the election, to account for that. And this article found an effect, an increase of generalized trust in a voting year. No, it's a trust in other people. Arguing that voting kind of has this kind of common feeling. It brings people closer to each other, and like this feeling arises that we are all kind of in the same boat. We are going through this kind of together. But it seems to be only temporary, right? Because it's only in the voting year, and so maybe it doesn't qualify as one of the effects that you would recognize because you are more into the stable effects. But I still think it's an interesting phenomenon that is related to what you're talking about. So maybe kind of worth triangulating this.
I mean, I think there are reasons to be a little bit surprised by that effect, given that like many elections are not this sort of like, let's all come together and solve collective problems together.
Well,
right?
it won't be in 2020.
Maybe, right? So I'm a little surprised about that effect. But I think your point is taken, right? Like we want to be careful here, right? We've explored specific outcomes. It's possible.
And for a specific generation.
Specific generation. I mean, that's a good point, right? You sort of alluded to the fact that some of these outcomes become more stable across the life course. That's kind of, I think, a reason to look among young people, right? As we've done in U.S. and Brazil. But yeah, I mean, it's totally possible that you could name an additional outcome. It just doesn't seem like the ones that have the strongest theoretical backing, interest, or knowledge, or the other ones that don't have an effect. But it's possible that it could be something else.
It's closely related conceptually to what you study, I think.
Yeah.
Trust.
Right. Yeah. So I'll take a look at that paper. Thanks for.
I will find it and send it to you.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. That sounds like a cool design too.
There has been an effort recently to change to make it easier for people in jail in France to participate to the election, in the hope that it would be in fact good for them to participate.
Yeah.
So, do you think this is the hope?
Depends what the goal is. If you want them to vote, probably it will work. But if you have expectations that like a get out the vote thing is going to like spill over into them being more socially aware of their neighbors, problems going on in their communities, I'm a little skeptical that it would do that on its own. Now, I should say, like, this is specific to the act of voting. I think there are reasons to suspect that if you treat people with other forms of civic engagement, you might have like positive effects. So like, for example, if as part of a reintegration campaign, you had them go to community meetings, or you had them work on a shared project with their neighbors, or you do something that's a little more involved than voting itself. I think part of the problem here is we're expecting a lot from voting, which is a very sort of short, intermittent act that doesn't happen that often. When it does happen, it's not that long and truly transformative. We can imagine a world where, in the case of sort of prisoner reintegration, or just in general trying to get people more civically active, we do something. The first thing they're exposed to, or the treatment that they're given, is more involved, it's more social, it's more time intensive. Maybe then it's transformational. But I mean, I'm aware of the studies in the U.S. that sort of say like reintegrating prisoners. There have been some studies that say there are ways to do that in the voting experience. I'm just not sure. It depends on what your goal is, right? If it's to get them political heft, the ballot box, maybe that's enough. But if you have other sort of transformative aspirations, I'm a little skeptical that voting is like the right lever to pull on.
In those other cases, are you, just to get a sense of sort of how your approaching is going forward?
Yeah.
Are you expecting then that those would be transformative, or is transformative just an unreasonable expectation for human behavior?
Yeah, right.
Very little.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good question, right? So it sort of gets to fundamental questions about human behavior. When you get people to do one thing, do they change in other ways, right? It's kind of it's a question you see in other domains as well. No, I mean, I'm not totally, I think it's possible, right, to see transformative effects. I think this is me speculating, one of the reasons why we've, taken, as political scientists, have taken such a strong stand on voting is it's one of the most common behaviors that we study, and we want to show those economists that they're wrong, and there's a reason to study this behavior. And I'm not saying that there isn't. I just think that when we say why we study voting, maybe we should focus more on sort of the electoral consequences, because we know who votes matters to who gets elected. But I just don't think the secondary channel of transformation is as much. But I'm not totally negative to other things. Like there's some really fascinating experiments that have been done in the UK that try and get sort of adolescents to volunteer in their communities more, to be like involved. And those have shown some evidence of transformative effects in terms of like pro-sociability, interacting with other people, sort of developing the skills that you need to do those types of things. So I think it's possible that you could definitely have transformative effects. I just don't believe it happens in most cases.
Hi.
Yeah. Hi.
I was wondering, you talked about some of the heterogeneous effects that you looked for, and there's two that I was wondering about. Have you looked at whether there's any differences in transformative effects among groups who've historically been marginalized from the voting process? So in Brazil, people from Afro-Caribbean or indigenous backgrounds who gained the right to vote later, or also youth who maybe never grew up talking about politics with their parents, or come from family backgrounds where their parents didn't vote.
Yeah.
I mean, you showed the null results pretty convincing, but I wonder if there is an effect to be found maybe for those groups of people that might be more transformative.
Yeah, so the first group, the sort of race ethnicity, both the U.S. and Brazil, there's not much there. There's not heterogeneity. It's pretty much null across the board. In terms of like family background and like levels of like pre-treatment engagement, it's just we just don't have those. We just don't have that information. This is a byproduct of using educational surveys for political science questions, right? In an ideal world, we would have something sort of well before any anticipatory effects would be happening, and we could look for differences there. The sort of cop-out answer is like we've looked across like race, socioeconomic status, the types of correlates of like early engagement and like family discussion. Don't see anything there. But it's possible that it could be sort of like this is a particularly effective way of transforming low engagement groups. It's possible.
Seemingly reasonable explanation why there is no effect is that these discontinuities are perfectly anticipated. So I'm going to be 18. Okay? I know perfectly 2 days before, then within 2 days I will be the same person, even if I will have. So in order to expect these statistical tools to detect transformation, maybe it would be more suitable to have a randomized effect. So by chance, it so happens that you can decide on something, and this then we have examples where people taken at random and be given a political power are transformed. By the way, so these are the experiments on the citizen assembly where the observation were that these people were transformed by the political power they were given.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could go either way, right? It's like if you want a transformative effect, maybe what you need is like a surprise, right? Like a treatment you weren't anticipating. To me, transformative effect is likely when you sort of have the chance to like prepare and like to like invest time and resources into it, right? So like if I were expecting a lasting effect to happen on political knowledge acquisition, I would actually argue that it's important for people to have like some level of anticipation so that they have the time to research the candidates and the issues at hand, right? So in that case, you would actually want some sort of level of anticipation of treatment so that they have the time to be able to invest these things in knowledge acquisition. But your point is totally taken, right? And this is why I think like it's important to like, it's pretty consistent across, so this, let's see, where's the RCT? So this is an RCT. Not anticipated. This is also an RCT. Discontinuity. A couple of RCTs and other ones. We're finding similar results across the two. So it's possible, right? But yeah, I think that's definitely right to be thinking about like the design itself. Is it set up and well suited for seeing transformative effects that do exist?
John, just following that.
Yeah.
Don't you think that the first time women had the right to vote, like their first election, might have had an impact?
Yeah, I mean, but this is, yeah, totally, right? Like, possibly. Or it was that the people who voted, the women who showed, I mean, and maybe that's the argument because that's part of why they got the right to vote, right? Is they were agitating, they were engaged, they were interested in this. So, yeah, and like, to be clear, like the Brazil and the U.S. data, these is restricted to first-time voters. Like it's a different generation. Voting, maybe the answer is that voting treatment today means something distinctly different than a voting treatment years and years ago.
What about immigrants who get to vote for the first time? Like they're given citizenship.
Yeah, I like that idea a lot. I don't think we can do it with our data set that we have. Well, that's not exactly true. So we're probably going to field another ACT survey in 2020. Actually, wait a minute. The nice thing about the ACT data is they have more information about the subjects than just on the survey. So they have all the information about the enrollment application for the exams for both cases. So maybe the ACT has immigrant status. We probably, going into 2020, we would want to oversample that group. So we have enough of them. We didn't specifically put that in the sampling design in 2018. It wasn't there in 2016. So I don't think we can answer it yet, but I think it's a great idea to. But I mean, the general consensus is like sort of like finding the group where voting is most transformative. I think that's an interesting way to think about this. I mean, I think it's important to sort of acknowledge that like even if there's a subgroup where it's transformative, on average, it's not, right? So like there are immigrants in our pool, there are women in our pool, there are various demographics. So you get to a null effect in many different ways. If it's a small group that has a big positive effect, then there's a big group of people who have a zero or a negative effect, right? Like that's just how it work out. So yeah, but this point is taken, right? Like in an ideal world, we would have like all of these pre-treatment characteristics and look for heterogeneity across all of them, right? Yeah, the ones we've done so far: race, gender, socioeconomic status, social composition of the number of people voting around you.
But not on the DV yourself, not on political interest, for example.
Oh, so if I'm exposed by a lot of people who are interested and I get a vote.
Oh, only the whether you fall
Yeah, so
into
what we've done is the number of people voting together. So it's sort of like, well, the way we were thinking of it is like a voting treatment is different in an area where very few people around you are voting versus it's sort of like souped up in areas where lots of people are voting. So, yeah, I mean, I guess we could maybe do some kind of like by interest levels with focusing on like the control groups.
Well, I guess before you totally conclude that voting does not matter in any kind of way for anyone, I think I would like to see the effect being repeated in an adult sample, because young people, although important and impressionable and all of that, malleable, let's say, are still a specific group that go through a lot of changes in life where voting plays maybe a minor role, right? Education, jobs, family separation, well, all kinds of things, relationships. So, I mean, if you don't show me at all that this is happening in a more adult population anywhere, I still not gonna buy it completely.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, I think that's fair, right? Like, the assumption that we're making is that the young people are providing the best test case because we know from political behavior research, like political interest kind of hardens over the life course as you get older. The chances of moving that get lower, right? Sort of Marcus Pryor's work.
Yeah.
And to be clear, some of these were run on adults, not all adults, right? So, like, I'm thinking of the Shine
So the
study.
meta-analysis is,
Picking up on
Yes,
some of the adults. Yeah. So, but the point on the regression discontinuity is taken. So we would love to be able to do this with the other end of the. So when compulsory voting drops off after 80, they just don't take. I mean, it sounds kind of obvious to say, but like they don't take the high school exit exam, and so we would just have to run our own survey. It's possible, right? We could do that. Yeah. I think that point is taken, though, right? It's like, so in order for that to be the case, right, you have to sort of say, like, maybe these outcomes are just more noisy among young people.
Yeah, exactly.
Substantively, political interest, political knowledge, they don't care as much about it, so it's just not really like a meaningful thing. Yeah, so I think that's fair. That's fair. Yeah.
And you are convinced, Andre?
Absolutely.
Oh, wow, that's very. You hit the jackpot today.
Man, you should say nice things about me before the presentation. Wow, today is a great day.
Yeah,
February
seriously.
20th, 2020. Wow, 21st. I will remember this day forever.
It has basically never happened at any trial.
Wow. You were all here. I was convinced.
Any more questions?
And also that he doesn't ask a question is very. I just don't recognize you.
Well, in fact, that's the point this is very, very much in line with Marcus Pryor. You know, the stability of political interest, and because interest is one of your two sort of major dimensions. It's very, very much in line with that political interest doesn't seem to be much. It's hard, and even in election year, because Pryor has a sort of a small analysis of the election year.
I mean, this also sort of aligns with my like other work. It's like if you want to move these types of things, you might want to start earlier than like 16, 17, 18. Right? Lots happening in childhood and adolescence. We should, this is a nodding head. Yeah, I think we should maybe like be looking to earlier ages. Maybe. Okay, so obviously like voting isn't eligible. They're not eligible in like 10, 11, 12, 13, right? But maybe there's some way to get like transformational type effects by doing some type of intervention like you're doing in schools or something along these lines.
Yeah, you know, like I was, you know, listening to your analysis, and I'm like thinking, you know, like what about like these student votes programs?
Yeah.
And you know, like, but there's a conflation because it's not just about voting. That like if we were to do like an analysis like that, it's like it's voting plus like the whole like civic program and the buzz around it.
I think like the idea, like it would be hard to sort of say like this is the transformative effect of voting in a school election. I think ultimately like that's a nice exercise for like theory building to sort of say like does voting itself affect these things? At the end of the day, if you find me a treatment that moves, you know, volunteering, voter turnout, interest, knowledge all together, it doesn't like to me like hooray, like we did it, like it doesn't, you know, it's a policy success. But yeah.
Because also like I'm thinking like, you know, these are like elections, it's politics. As Dithan was saying, you know, like young people, politics, like it might not appeal like would, you know, voting on different things like, I don't know, boards or like a community, like a local election, something like in the neighborhood, like kind of like smaller scale votes, but that are more meaningful, kind of like the outcome is gets closer to home. This could be more transformative because it's just like it's more concrete for people. Like they're, I don't know, there's a part of it that like, you know, political results are very abstract, so it's not.
It sort of reminds me of like Eitan Hirsch's new book, which is like sort of like moving us towards like a hierarchy of civic acts. He's thinking about like transfers of political power. But you could sort of like say, like, let's rank order the types of civic engagement that are most likely to have transformative effects themselves. And my prior is that the ones that are more time intensive, more substantive, more social, more problem solving, more skill developing than just pulling a lever, right? So to speak, they have the potential to be transformative. So I'm going to close the book on that. Last question.
So I was thinking about a potential heterogeneity.
Yes.
This is in the context of an exam.
Yeah.
So you know the topics that people have to write the exam on. So do you have something related to, I know, civic culture, civic education, or a certain kind of people in Brazil kind of choosing that type of topic, or I don't know too much about what things are happening
Yeah, so
there.
the exam does provide a lot of rich information. It's I'm trying to remember. We don't have the individual like responses to the exam. We have what they took.
Yeah,
We
something
don't
like that.
have like the essay itself. that they wrote about.
No, but even just a topic.
Yeah,
could
right.
Say something.
The thing we have close to that in the U.S. is whether or not they took a civics class, or like I forget how it was worded, but we asked them about their course taking. Actually, well, we didn't ask them. Like this effect actually shows up when people are taking more civics classes. So I don't know if that gets to what you're saying, but yeah, I mean, I think like the point is taken, right? Like ultimately, you sort of want to like look for these heterogeneities a bit more than what we've done. So I think there's an opportunity for that. I remain open to this. Like I'm going to be pragmatic about this, right? Like it's possible there's some subgroup that there's an effect. I would assume that there is a large group of people where there is no effect. And so what do we make of that, right? What's the substantive conclusion if there's a small subgroup of people where there's a big transformative effect, but for most people there's not anything?
I think all this discussion about the heterogeneous effects is just everyone wanting to get at a mechanism.
Yeah, sure.
Just try to understand why this is happening. Yeah, this is striking.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
You not. Oh.
Oh.
Small